Morning, church. If we haven't met yet, my name is Adrian. I feel like as if I'm standing in front of Mount Everest, about to climb it. We have all seen the word today, the Bible, the text today, and it is a very hard to preach, a very hard text to preach, and this is going to be my first time preaching in English as well. So I ask for your grace and for your prayers as well to support me. Let me ask by asking you a question. Asking you to imagine. For example, if you and your family have decided to uproot from Melbourne and leave and move to an unpopulated foreign land where there is no government yet, there's no law there, and then soon other families will join you to live in that foreign land, I'm sure eventually, soon enough, you will begin to realize that in order that there is harmony and safety in this new place, somebody has to lay down some sort of guideline and laws about how to live together. Those guidelines, I'm sure we know that, and rules and laws are there so that there can be a common understanding on how things work and how to live together. And what are the set of behavioral expectations that we have of each other so that people can thrive in that land? Well, that's exactly what God is doing with Israel in this text. This is what God's doing with this nation of Israel. And now we have to remember, why do I do a air quote there? We must remember that this is the first time Israel is called a nation. Israel has never been a nation before. Israel came to Egypt as a family, remember? And then generations later, precisely probably around 400 years, they found themselves enslaved by the Egyptians. They lived under the rule of slavery under Pharaoh. For how long, we're not sure. And they're accustomed to living under the Egyptian laws governed by a monarchy, Pharaoh. Pharaoh instituted the laws. Pharaoh interpreted all the laws. And Pharaoh decided what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's not good, who lives, who dies. Everything is decided by Pharaoh. And now, after redeeming Israel from Egypt, God is spending time with Israel to establish and lay down laws and understanding what is right according to God, what is wrong, what is good and what is bad according to God, what is clean and unclean, what is holy and what is unholy. And this is God's grace. Ironically, we tend to think about God's law as something that is restrictive, something that is burdensome. But actually, this is God's good gift to the nation of Israel. It is a good thing to give so that people can know how to relate to God and how to relate to one another, how to live in such a way that there can be peace, there can be safety and harmony. And so God gave the laws for the goodness of Israel. It would be nice if everyone would see it that way and would follow. But we know that the world is broken. We know that Israel is also a group of fallen, sinful people. And even today, we all want justice, don't we? We all want justice. It is in our hearts. We have an inbuilt or God-given sense of what is right and what is wrong. But even with that, it is very hard to agree on what justice requires. Take, for example, I saw a news item from a few weeks ago. The Bali terrorist bomber released after serving just half the sentence. Personally, I thought he should have received the death sentence. But now he's free after serving just half the sentence, a few years. And it's hard to find agreement on this kind of cases, and We just need to listen to some talk shows where everyone has different opinions. Although we all want justice, we don't always agree what justice requires. And not even our legal system has all the answers. We see this time and time again. A jury reaches a verdict, but the judge throws it out on a technicality. A judge makes a decision only to have it overturned on appeal. And sometimes we even see a fitting punishment to the offender, yet the victims continue to suffer without suitable compensation. In the end, we are left wondering whether justice has really been done. Justice is hard because we live in a complex and unjust world filled with sinful humans, you and I. And I believe as Christians, God calls us to seek and to live as people of justice in the world. And let's study the Word of God. Although as hard as it is from today's text, let's try and see what we can learn from this text. So I've decided to divide my sermon into 3 portions. The first one is the principle of justice. Second one is the purpose of justice. And the third one is the price of justice. The principle of justice. Now, a few weeks ago, again, I watched a lot of YouTube videos, but I saw and learned something new about pandas. Did you know that pandas, when they give birth to twins, which is quite often, it's like half of the time, the pandas that give birth to twins would almost always abandon one cub to take care of the other one. It's thought that they don't have the sufficient milk or energy to care for 2 cubs. I mean, as a parent of a 1-year-old, right? Amy and I barely have the energy to care for 1 baby, so it's quite relatable for me. But so the panda keepers in China, they devised a cunning plan. So they remove one of the cubs at birth, and then throughout the day, they continually distract the panda and switch out the cub so that the panda thinks that she only has 1 cub. Now, the interesting thing for me is I read the comments on that YouTube video, and they're all commenting on how brilliant the plan is, on how caring the keepers are, and how small and cute the panda cubs are. But no one commented on how bizarre that pandas would almost always abandon 1 cub to take care of the other one. Even one of the comments even said, "Oh, a mother's love for her children is amazing." I mean, are you sure? Are you watching the same video as I am? I mean, if a human would do that, give birth and then abandon one to take care of the other one, what would we say? We would say, that's just wrong, that's just unfair, that's just unjust, inhumane, right? So the question is, why do we humans care so much about justice? The Bible has an answer on page 1 of the Bible. So we learn that humans are set apart from all the other creatures as the image of God. Genesis 1, verse 26 to 27 says, "Then God said, 'Let us make man in our image, after our likeness, and let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, and over the birds of the heavens, and over the livestock, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth.' So God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them." See, the image of God is God's investment in humanity. As images of God, we are to reflect images, right? We are to reflect God in our character and capability. We are to reflect God in our relationship with one another, because our God is the Trinitarian God. Our God has a perfect relationship within the Trinity, and we are to reflect that relationship to one another as well. And the third thing, as images of God, is that we are to reflect God in being God's representative to rule the world by his definition of good and evil. So because of the image of God being inbuilt in us, we do have an inbuilt God-given sense of justice, of what is right and what is wrong. And this identity as images of God is the basis or the principle behind biblical justice. So the biblical justice is this: all humans, every person that has ever been created, that has ever lived, all humans are equal before God because everyone has been created in the image of God. And therefore, everyone has the right to be treated with dignity, with fairness, no matter who you are. It doesn't matter what attributes you have, where you're from, what you've done. Everyone has the right to be treated with the dignity and fairness because of the image of God. Now, it would be nice if we all just do that. But we know we live in a sin-wrecked world. And since sins entered the world, the Bible shows that we are constantly redefining what is good and evil to our own advantage and at the expense of others. We continually disregard the God-given dignity and value of other human beings for our own benefits. We rob, we oppress, we take advantage the weak and the vulnerable, the easier it is if they are weak and vulnerable. We deem others as not worthy of living, just as I was like deeming that bomber as not worthy of living. We don't care for the safety of other people. We just care for our own benefits. We bring down other people to elevate ourselves. Well, in our text today, we see some examples of realities of sin and injustice that God is providing laws for. We see there's premeditated murder. We see abuse and dishonoring of parents. We see kidnapping and human trafficking, or slavery, or forced slavery. We see personal injuries. We see abuse of slaves. We see recklessness that caused injuries and even death of women, pregnant women and unborn children. Criminal negligence leading to loss of life or property. See, God knew that this thing will happen in a community filled with sinful people like Israel, even though they have been redeemed from Egypt. And that is why God has provided Israel with these laws that we are reading today. So what happens when injustice does happen? So we go on to the second point. We need to see the purpose of justice. When an injustice does happen, God has provisioned these laws in order to, there's three things: to uphold, to defend, and to restore. This is quite different to what we initially thought. I thought when I saw this text in the first time, I thought it was going to be just on punishment. But actually, as I study it, it's all about upholding, defending, restoring, while at the same time punishing as well. Now, to uphold, I think we can all agree that all crimes are sins against God. However, some crimes do more damages than others and therefore deserve a more severe punishment. And God has given us a sense of proportion so that punishment should fit the crime. And this is true today as well. If I speed under 10 kilometers per hour over the speed limit, it will be different. The fines will be different than when I speed over 50 kilometers per hour over the speed limit. It makes sense. And the sense of the punishment has to fit the crime can be found in verse 23 to 24. It says that, "But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe." And now let's take a look at verse 12 to 14. Whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall be put to death. But if he did not lie in wait for him, but God let him fall into his hand, then I will appoint for you a place to which he may flee. But if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning, you shall take him from my altar, that he may die. Now, verses 12 and 14 are quite specific, and it talks about intentional, premeditated murder. It says, so that he dies. And verse 14, if a man willfully attacks another to kill him by cunning. Whereas verse 13, it talks more about unpremeditated or unplanned killing. It says, God let him fall into his hand. So this can mean accidental death, unintentional killing, or in terms of self-defense. Well, in most ancient cultures, when someone gets killed, the offender would have been killed in an act of revenge or retaliation from the victim's aggrieved family. And we must remember this is the age where it's a culture of honor and shame. If you dishonor my family, I will dishonor you. So that can happen. But we can clearly see that God here is making provision for a better way of justice to be done for these involuntary homicide cases. God appoints a number of cities of refuge where these involuntary killers would run to the sanctuary and put his hands on the altar of God, because they know when they are there, it is the holiest place. They could not be touched until authorities had a chance to investigate the crime properly. And in the end, after the due process of investigation, if it is judged that the crime was indeed an accident, then the perpetrator is allowed to live. But if not, then the verse 14 comes into play. Take him from my altar. He cannot find refuge even then. He may die. That's the first case for death sentence. Now the second another case for death sentence is in verse 16. Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death. So stealing a person, or better known as kidnapping, and selling the person, also known as human trafficking, is also a capital offense, punishable by death. And this is true not only for the seller, but also for the one who bought the person, because anyone found in possession too shall be put to death. Now, if we look at the death sentence with the 21st century eyes, we might think, how barbaric, right? And this is talking about stoning to death. But what is the law saying by handing down death sentence for these kinds of crime? If I flip that question around, what would the law be saying if those kinds of crime, premeditated murder or human trafficking, can be punished by monetary compensation only? What would that law be saying if those kinds of crime can be paid only by money? So what it is actually saying with the death sentence, the death sentence is the only penalty that preserves and upholds the value, the dignity, and the sanctity of the human life. Any other punishment will be inadequate. And this is not a new law that God established with Moses. It has been established this legal principle has been established long before it was ever given to Moses. After the great flood in Genesis 9, God said, "And for your lifeblood I will require a reckoning. From every beast I will require it, and from man, and from his fellow men I will require a reckoning for the life of man. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. For God made man in his own image." we come back to our text today, you can search, but you can never find that no kind of injury or death of livestock or property is punishable by death. And on the flip side, there's no human trafficking or murder that is punishable only by monetary compensation. See, no human life can be equated with a mere property. Death sentence is the strongest statement that it is not okay to diminish the life of another human being because that person is created in the image of God. Now, some people might say, isn't it self-contradicting? Killing by killing? Like death sentence for death, for murder? But actually, the sixth commandment, thou shalt not murder, the word being used there is specifically for homicide. And it's a different word being used for the judicial use of deadly force to carry out a just punishment for these kinds of heinous crime. So death sentence says a lot. It also says that there is equality before the law. Verse 12, it says, whoever strikes a man, in ESV, it is a man, but in other translations, it is basically just a person. It doesn't specifically say a man. In CSB, in NIV, in NET, it's more general. It does not differentiate between whether the person is a male or female. It doesn't differentiate between a young or old person, a higher class or a lower class, a different social standing. It is certainly true. Like if you see all the ancient Near East law collection, there are other laws that differentiate between higher class, lower class, slaves. But here we see, this is evident even in verse 20, that when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. So even slaves are protected by this law. And I must note that this is astonishingly unique because scholars have searched all the other ancient Near East law collection and no other comparable laws can be found regarding punishment for killing your own slave at the time. In those kind of laws out there, not in Israel, capital punishment was only warranted if you murdered someone of the same or higher class. But if you murder someone of a lower class, you just need to pay 30 shekels of silver. That's shocking. So the first purpose of justice by death sentence we see is to uphold the dignity, the value and sanctity and equality of the human life because God made man in his own image. Now, do we see, when we see a person, we see people on the streets or we meet people, do we see the image of God in them? It can be really hard, especially when I'm driving and I see a hoon, someone driving recklessly on the road. Or when I meet a homeless person who curses at me for not giving them some change, it can be really hard for me to see the image of God in them. It can be really hard to see, a group assignment friend who never turns up for group meetings, and yet they take the credit in the end. But seeing those kinds of people, do you have compassion and feel sad that the image of God has deteriorated so badly because of the fall and the effects of sin? Another question is, do we differentiate or discriminate or show favoritism to certain groups of people like race, age, gender, social standing, talents. Sometimes we see, oh, this guy has got more talents than others. Or disabilities on the flip side. Do we differentiate and discriminate against them? Are we measuring another person by his or her merits? Or are we treating everyone as equally precious in the sight of God? Well, I admit that we might not be committing murder, but gossip is a kind of murder of character and reputation. I believe the church should be one of the most welcoming places on earth for anyone. And we are to uphold the God-given value and dignity of the human life. The second purpose of justice is to defend. So the first one was to uphold. The second one is to defend. So who is the law defending here from our text? The first group of people are the vulnerable women and children. Verse 22 to 25. When men strive together and hit a pregnant woman so that her children come out, but there is no harm, the one who hit her shall surely be fined, as the woman's husband shall impose on him, and he shall pay as the judges determine. But if there is harm, then you shall pay life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. So the first group of people that we can see that the law or justice is defending is the vulnerable women and children. And I think we all agree that pregnant women and babies are one of the most vulnerable groups of people. See, the words there, so that her children come out, it can mean there's a premature but viable birth, but also it can also mean a miscarriage. So the part in verse 23 where it says, but if there is harm, it could mean death or permanent disability, either of the baby or of the mother. In either case, I believe we all agree that it's a devastating result of someone's recklessness because of quarreling, striving together, and then hitting them. But the point here is our recklessness, our negligence, our lack of due care is culpable. We are responsible for them. And the point here is that we can clearly see that the law is there to defend the vulnerable person, the vulnerable group of people, and especially pregnant women and unborn babies. And we can see by extension here that a fetus is deemed as a person with dignity and value who deserves special protection. It treats the injury of death or death of an unborn child the same way it treats the injury or death of any other human being. So in the end, we see life for life. If the child or the fetus, the unborn child dies, then the offender dies too. Now the second group of people is the justice is defending is interestingly the slaves, and we've been we hear Christians preaching last week about this, so I will not spend too much time here, but I will read for you the verses. Verse 20, when a man strikes his slave, male or female, with a rod and the slave dies under his hand, he shall be avenged. But if the slave survives a day or two, he is to be avenged, for the slave is his money. Now, verse 21 here, I know it grates our modern ears because it sounds very unpleasant, right? The slave is his money. But basically, what it means is that any loss of time, so we need to read this in verse 18 and 19 in context. When there's quarrel and then there's injury, then the one who injures the other person needs to compensate for the loss of time and for medication to get the person healed. So basically, if you injured, now the slave is working for the master. If the master injures his own slave, that means the loss of the slave's time and productivity is the master's own loss. That's what it means by the slave is his money. So that's why he needs not to be avenged, because it's his own loss. It's its own interest to keep the safety of the slave. And by the way, verse 26 and 27, it talks about injuries of eyes and teeth of the slave. And the just punishment, the law says, is that the slave must go free. So we know by this that the expression eye for eye, tooth for tooth is not meant to be a literal sense. It doesn't mean that if you poke out my eye, that means it gives me a right to poke out your eye. It's just an expression that the punishment needs to fit the crime. But either case, it is amazing, I think, that the law of God would actually give this much rights to defend the slaves. This is incomparable to any other ancient Near East laws. And the third purpose of justice is to restore. In the clause regarding injury or death to pregnant women, we see just now, has been repeated a few times, life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on. This is most famously called lex talionis. It is a principle developed in early Babylonian law that basically says that criminals should receive as punishment precisely those injuries and damages they had inflicted upon their victims. So whatever you did to your victims, that's what you'll receive as punishment. The Babylonian laws took it literally, but not in Israel, as we have seen. But interestingly, has anyone heard someone quote that eye for eye, tooth for tooth? Yes. Interestingly, we don't usually quote that law, eye for eye, when we are in the wrong, right? We tend to quote it when we think someone else needs to be punished for what they did to us or to someone else, someone we care. So by that, we are actually thinking that eye for eye is actually a license for us to take vengeance into our own hands. But in reality, if we are honest, when we are the victims and we want to take revenge, it is in our nature to want to make the offender to suffer more than we did. If you poke out one eye of me, I will poke out both of your eyes. Be prepared. If you knock out my teeth, I will chop off your head. That's our nature, to respond in an unfair way. In retaliation, we tend to want the offender to suffer more than us. However, if we read carefully this verse, the subject of paying life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, and so on, is not the victim. It doesn't say then the victim can take life for life or eye for eye. It says, you, the offender, shall pay life for life or eye for eye. So it is quite the opposite of how we tend to use the quote, right? It is actually about restorative justice. Just as the offender, we must make it up to the victim. We must restore as much as we can of what is lost, of what is fair. Not always literally, but we must pay for what is fitting to the crime that we did. That's what it is, eye for eye, actually. Because if eye for eye is simply a law of retaliation, then Gandhi would be right. He said, an eye for an eye makes the whole world blind. And it is interesting to note that in most laws dealing with injury and damage in our text today, more attention is given to appropriate restitution or compensation to the victim rather than the punishment of the offender. In fact, the just punishment to the offender is actually a right or fitting restitution or compensation to the victim. So it is incredibly fair what we are seeing here. We can see in the case of injury to another person, when we have seen this, when someone strikes the other person with a stone, and if he does not die, then he rises again and walks outdoors with his staff. He who struck him shall be clear, only he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall have him thoroughly healed. It's fair. So also the case of injury or death of another person's animals, Exodus verses 33 to 36. This is talking about negligence. When a man opens a pit, or when a man digs a pit and does not cover it, an ox or a donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restoration. He shall give money to its owner, and the dead beast shall be his. Basically just buying the dead beast or the dead animal at market price. 35, 36, when one man's ox butts another's so that he dies, then they shall sell the live ox and share its price, and the dead beast also they shall share. Or if it is known that the ox has been accustomed to gore in the past, and its owner has not kept it in, so basically he's failed to exercise due care or due diligence to secure the animal, then he shall repay ox for ox, and the dead beast shall be his. Now, I know that these laws are 3,500 years apart from today, so it might seem like weird. I don't think is anyone got an ox at home or a donkey? I don't think so, but we must remember that during that period, oxes, donkeys, livestock are the source of a person's livelihood. They are not just accessories. So any injuries or deaths of someone's ox or animals can be a direct threat to someone's livelihood. So we can see the third purpose of justice is to restore. The first one is to uphold, second was to defend, and the third one is to restore what is lost, whilst the cost is also a just punishment to the offender. Now while both restitution and punishment are both important, I think we all agree that it can be very easy for us to adopt a corporate thirst for vengeance against the wrongdoers, but also at the same time we overlook the suffering of the victims. We are so focused on retributive justice, we are so focused on punishing the offender, yet we forget to take care of the suffering victim. God's laws given to Israel is a very caring one, a very fair one, given to care to restore the victims. When someone wrongs us, what is our first response? Or when we witness a wrongdoing done to others, what is our first response? Do we seethe with rage against the perpetrators? And only that? Or do we devise plans of retaliation and that will do more damage than we receive? Or if the victim is someone else, do we move toward caring for the victims first? And finally, the price of justice. So we've discussed the principle of justice, that all humans are equal before God, because everyone has been created in the image of God, and therefore everyone has the right to be treated with dignity and fairness, no matter who you are. And we have discussed the three purposes of justice: to uphold, to defend, and to restore. Now, in all of these cases, restoring justice is not cheap. It costs something. Behind the upholding, behind defending and restoring, there is punishment to be paid by the offender. But we need to remember that the punishment is not executed by the victim or the victim's relatives. It's only the state or the divinely appointed judges that are legally allowed to determine whether someone is guilty or innocent, and therefore they are the only ones that can hand down and execute punishment. It is the higher law that the offender is actually violating. That's why we are not to take vengeance into our own hands. It is the higher law that the offender has violated first. And that is the same way that all moral law actually begins with God, because of the image of God, right? We were created in the image of God, and we have His moral law written in our hearts. And this is evident when Adam and Eve, after they've sinned, they ran away to hide from God. The shame after sinning was intuitive to them because of the image of God. And we too, intuitively, we know when we sin, we are not right with God. So in a very real sense, when we sin, every sin that we do is against the Most High God. First and foremost, it is a sin against God. That's why David says, "To you and you only have I sinned, O God." When we sin against our neighbor, we sin against God as the moral lawgiver. It is then